You're listening to the Forest School Podcast. Delicious waffle chat about education, nature connection, child development, community building, and lots more. Hosted by Lewis Ames and Wem Sutherden.
Hello, listeners. I got it in there before you could sing a song.
Yes.
I did it.
Yeah,
But you did make some fart noises.
Okay,
so
do you know
it's
what
fine.
it is? Because
What?
somebody who is listening to this, who told us that they listen to this while they clean their bathroom, and you know who you are listening, cleaning your bathroom, said, it's got all professional
Cleaning the
lately.
toilet.
Let's clean the toilet. They said, there's no more, podcast isn't very bum and sticks. And guess what? That both of us the next day were like, well, we've got to do something fucking stupid now, haven't we? Like,
We've got to up the bum and
that's
six quota quickly.
that's
Stat.
red rag to a bull, isn't it? Unfortunately, if you tell us that we're doing something well. No, we're not. Shut up.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know that he was saying we were doing it well.
Oh yeah, that's
He
true.
just said,
No,
he
just said more
there was a very
professional.
different feel. He just said there was a different feel. And he was
Okay.
sad about the lack of bum and sticks. So, yeah. Here's some
Professional
bum, here's some
podcasters slag
sticks.
off their audience one by one, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
That's what
All
they
the
do.
time. All the time.
One by...
Yeah.
It's going to be you next time, John. I don't know who John is, but
No.
someone's just shit themselves.
Yeah.
All my days, all my days, all my
My brain hurts.
days.
We just had a very excellent discussion with Robert Poynton, who you discovered first of all, didn't you? Through his book.
I did, through the do lectures.
Improvise.
So, do you know about the do's?
Well,
Do you know about the do's?
do
Do you know about the do's?
do that.
Do 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 do
I
do
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 a bit.
do do.
No, right. Yes, I do, because my other half went to some do lectures one time. I keep saying to my other half, you'll know this guy. You will have met this guy. You will have had a chat with this guy at some point. Maybe he has, because they move in similar circles. But I have never been to a do lecture or
Like TED
indeed
Talks, so
watched
people that
any
haven't come across
online.
them,
Yeah.
they're like collecting different things. I recently found in my local bookshop, which I was there supporting, a book of do lectures where it was not just, so the books that Robert's done are standalone books, but there is also like a do book, which is like, I think it was 10 or 15 different subject leaders all talking about different things. It was like a nice collection. It's a bit of a, what's the word when someone like collects things, like and puts them all together, curated things. So you can kind of trust that they are
Yes.
of a similar ilk and quality.
Yeah, man. There's a new one called Do Sing by James Sills, all about singing and music. And it's just,
Ooh.
just like people with a passion for something writing a thing. And yeah, it's very inspiring, isn't it?
It is.
And our chat with Robert was very inspiring. And I wish to comment on how eloquent he is and how I
Oh,
hung
yes.
up and I just reflected, how did he make the mouth words come out of his face hole like that? Do you know what I mean? Just like la 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 la, just a flow of very thought-provoking and interesting words without very many ums and ahs, or
Yeah, very well practiced at speaking. It was really
yes.
enjoyable.
Oh
There
yes.
were a few moments, I don't know if they'll come out in the edit because we get rid of some of the pauses, but there were some moments where I forgot that we were having a conversation and I thought I was just listening to a nice talk, and it was only when he stopped and I went,
Mm,
oh, my turn.
my turn
Oh,
now.
I talk now.
Yes, I felt
Ah,
that lots too. Yeah.
when I have to tell people
What?
that they can listen to this episode. If they're this far in and they're like, oh, it's going to be an advert in a minute. You're right, there is going to be an advert in a minute. Unless you're listening on our Patreon version or you're subscribed on see, some people can say the words and they come out the right way. Unless you're subscribed on Spotify or on our Patreon, because then you get all these episodes without adverts and you get all our like bonus episodes, and you get the thing where we put up stuff before we chat to people or before we've recorded an episode and go, hey, we've got some thoughts about this, or hey, we're going to talk about this, and we get to like have a chat with people before we do the recording. So they can find that if they go to patreon.com/The Forest School Podcast. You can sign up there. The lowest tier to get it without adverts is £2 a month. That's not even in a Tesco meal deal. That bad deal. Would you listen, between the two of us, would you get me and Wem a meal deal once a month? And we'd get rid of all the adverts for you for one meal deal.
Exactly.
And we won't even do the thing where we get like the really high ticket items, like the really good sandwich and an innocent smoothie. Just anything would be great. So you can get that patreon.com/The Forest School Podcast. There's also on our website, theforestschoolpodcast.com, there's a link to all our merch, things like that. I'm trying to do now every episode. I'm making up a thing, taking a quote and doing a little piece of art for it. So I just put up today, and when this will be news to you, if you go and have a look, there is a big old thing for Choffin Dock Off Beak.
I've seen the beautiful sticker
from Matt's song last week, last episode. So you can get that as a sticker, you can get it as a shirt. There's one that's very punk. There's Absolute Bum and Sticks. There's Wet Rope. There's Not Amnesia. All these quirky things we've said. Spiritual Mudlarking. If you want to grab a thing, you can head to theforestschoolpodcast.com.
Conversation starting.
And you can get yourself some cool stickers and merch and t-shirts and whatever else you fancy.
And also, if you fancy leaving us a review anywhere that you listen to the podcast, that'd be much appreciated. That
doesn't cost anything,
luscious.
But it helps us loads. Podcasts live and die word of mouth. So please write a review. Tell somebody. Download it on their phone. Take their phone, download it, subscribe to it now. Okay, just do it when they're not looking. Great.
Exactly.
Okay, that's enough silliness for now, I think. Should we get into this lovely chat with Robert?
Yeah.
As outdoor leaders and educators, we often find ourselves entrusted with sensitive information about our students, their families, and our fellow staff. From emergency contact details to medical information, ensuring the confidentiality of this data is paramount. But in today's digital age, protecting this information extends beyond the physical realm and into the online world. That's where NordVPN comes in. NordVPN is a trusted name in online security, providing a virtual private network that encrypts your internet connection and shields your online activities from prying eyes. With NordVPN, you can browse the web, communicate with parents, and manage administrative tasks with peace of mind, knowing that your data is safe from hackers, snoopers, and other threats. But NordVPN isn't just about security. It also offers flexibility and convenience, allowing you to access geo-blocked content, connect to public Wi-Fi hotspots securely, and bypassing censorship restrictions. Whether you're researching lesson plans, communicating with colleagues, or simply unwinding with some online entertainment, NordVPN ensures that you can do so safely and privately. So, fellow outdoor enthusiasts, if you are ready to take your online security up to the next level, I urge you to sign up to NordVPN today by using the link in the show notes. You'll not only safeguard your sensitive data, but also support the continued exploration and enjoyment of the great outdoors through this podcast. Stay safe, stay secure, and let's keep the spirit of adventure alive, both in the forest and online. Hey everybody, we're here with Robert Poynton, who we're here for the second time with Robert. We had a chat it was exactly a week ago, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
We had a chat. I have been reading a couple of Robert's books, and I've given them over to Wem as well. Robert, I'm going to try to summarize what I think it is that you do, and then you can go, no, not quite that. I'm reading off your website. It says you're a facilitator, experienced designer, and writer. And I was really an experienced designer. I might pinch that one if that's all right, because the conversation we had last week, where we were talking to Robert about what Forest School is, and we kind of went, oh, I do that, and it was just, but tell us, people who are listening who might not have come across your work, how would you describe what it is that you do and have done?
I think my focus really is on creating containers and creating the conditions within those containers so that people can kind of come alive, and learning is part of that, but only part of it. So it's really about the creating conditions for people to connect. And so experienced designer is a term that people use for that. I work in all sorts of different contexts. Sometimes I work with businesses, sometimes I work in educational contexts, sometimes I work with families, but I'm always thinking about and holding a space for people. And I hope that those spaces are spaces which are kind of lively and creative and collaborative. That's kind of, the easiest way to describe it, really.
Mm.
I think that's going
And
to
you're
resonate with so many forest school people, though. Just that description of holding spaces and that they're lively. It's just, yeah, I don't know anybody that doesn't want that. Sorry, Wen, what were you gonna?
I was just going to say, and yes, your books, I don't think we mentioned the titles, Do Pause and Do Improvise are the ones that we have been looking at in detail. But also last week you were telling us about an example of one of these sort of spaces that you've created. Was it during COVID or just post-COVID, the Yellow Project? Could you
Oh
tell us a
yeah,
bit about that?
yeah.
Because I think that might be really interesting to
Yeah,
listeners.
sure. So yellow was my response, or one of my responses to the pandemic, and the question there was, given that we can't be physically together, how do we, what do people need actually was the question, and this is in the context of leadership. So I work a lot with business leaders or leaders from all kinds of organizations, and what we set about exploring and experimenting with was the online medium, which I had always avoided like the plague because I didn't find it fruitful or interesting. And I discovered, of course, that I was prejudiced and biased like everybody else, and there were all sorts of things you could do. But there were some conditions. Yellow took the form of small groups of people, really small groups, 6 people, and my partner Alex and I holding and running them. And conversations over a long period of time. So those would run for 6 months, and the group would meet for 2 hours every 2 weeks. And Alex and I would design each session afresh as a function of what happened from the previous one, which was kind of fabulously perverse and inefficient, not what you're meant to do at all. Um, uh,
That's what we do all the time. That is
Absolutely, yeah.
our bread and
Yeah.
butter.
But that enables you to actually respond to who's in the room and what's actually coming up. And I think that's where some of the aliveness comes from, even in a fairly meager medium like the online one. And so, what we would design wouldn't be a program even, it would be a beginning, if you like. It would be a set of stimulus. And what we discovered, part of those prejudices were just ignorance really on my part, because we discovered, well, actually, you can get people to join via a phone and walk around and talk to each other and pair them up and do a walk and talk, or you could get them to eat things, you can get them to dance, to make art, to look at art, to write poetry, to make models, to play with cardboard, to review books. You can do all sorts of things. And I think the small scale is a fundamental part of that. As soon as you start getting online, to kind of even into the 20s, it's the possibilities diminish massively. And one of the things I think we kind of, one of my reflections coming out of that, we ran that for 3 years, and now it's evolving almost to the opposite. So now we're going to go back and only do in-person stuff because we feel that need to be regenerated and replenished ourselves. But one of the things I think I learned was that in a way, when you meet online, you just have to be better. You have to be more disciplined. So my looking back, my reflection is when people meet normally, even if they choose a really boring meeting room and they have all the boring things like a PowerPoint deck and an agenda and all those things, people are so amazing, they make it work. They kind of wink at each other across the table, or they gossip at the water cooler, or they kind of gesture. And so most kind of conventional physical meetings work in spite of the conditions, not because of them. And that is revealed online. So online, you have to think about those things more carefully, be more diligent, be more careful. And of course, what you're doing when you take somebody out of a very meager, impoverished environment like a school or a classroom or a meeting room with chairs and tables that all face the same way and point at the front where the power sits, and bring them into a wild and natural environment like the forest, is you get a fabulously wonderful different result. You get everything kind of changes. You've got a wealth of stimuli, and I wish often we could do board meetings in the forest or leadership gatherings in the forest.
Mm. I have had people come, and it's really interesting. It was slightly before when joined, and I was running it was semi well-being day for an NHS team, and they all came for the morning, and it was great because their team leader wasn't there, and so we just did welfare stuff. We just did mindfulness, and we made charcoal, and we did this stuff, and then their team leader arrived at lunch, and the mood, and she needed to justify it being there and justify like I have covered certain. And so she brought to the woods like one of those big A3 flip chart things and sat round the circle, and the mood like palpably went kind of like it was really interesting that like that she was very much in like, this is how we work and this is what I'm doing. You know, it was a one-way delivery rather than the rest of the day was also collaborative and moving around and doing all those things. And
well, I mean, God, I could talk about that for hours and probably write another whole book about it. I mean, suffice to say, in this context, I think just to say that in a way, my life's work is about trying to change that, trying to kind of open people up to different possibilities, trying to get them to acknowledge that that isn't actually not only is it not a very healthy way to behave, it's not a very effective way to behave, and more to the point, it's not necessary. People try and spend too much energy, too much time, too much effort, and too much emotion trying to control things because that's what we do. Nobody really ever stops to ask, well, why do we do that? And is that useful? If you go to the other extreme, you say, well, imagine I could, any of your listeners now, tell you exactly what you're going to do for the rest of your life. Every meal you're going to have, every person you're going to speak to, how you're going to spend each day. That wouldn't amount to much of a life. So I talked about liveliness in the gatherings I try and host. If everything is planned, detailed, predicted, and organized, all that gives you is some sense of security. Also, by the way, that will fail because always something will happen that you're not going to anticipate or expect. So you're sort of dooming yourself to failure to get something that would be horrible if you achieved it. Wow. You know, and put that way, you kind of think the whole way we live our lives at this point in our history is kind of nonsensical, really.
It's such an interesting, for us, I would say we're trying to find a balance between those things, because lots of our work involves people who have like either high levels of anxiety, possibly because they're expecting to know, you know, so we sometimes try and balance this like improvised nature of what we're doing, and things may crop up and hey, there's frog spawn and we didn't know that was going to be there kind of thing. And then also we have some learners that have come to us over the years for whom we were kind of at that other end where we would arrive and there'd be a blank blackboard and we go, anything you want to do today, kids, that's what's on the thing. And realize that actually that's too much for some people. Like you were saying about containers, it's like for different people in different groups trying to find, I think it's in the improvisation book, you talk about the creativity that comes from like constraints and some restrictions.
Absolutely.
And so that thing of like, sorry, go on.
No, just one of the myths is that improvisation is just pure talent and everything's plucked out of the air. That's not true. If it were, then I would have had nothing to work with over the last 25 years, because I'm not one of those talented people and I don't work or live in the theatre. So this is a question of context on the one hand and appropriate constraint on the other. So by context, what I mean is, if we were doing this podcast in the late 17th century, just ignore the technical complications of that for the moment, I would be an advocate, I think, of structure, order, detail, planning, documentation in spades, because at the end of the 17th century, the world was, or felt like, a capricious, mysterious, magical place, which had good things about it. But it was so mysterious and capricious that a loved one could die overnight for no apparent reason. Nobody understood anything. The world was a very, very different place. So fast forward a few hundred years, with the benefit of, all that Newton's work and the science and technology that it spawned has given us. And we're now in a different context where we've got too much of that structure in general, is my observation. And so we need to leaven it and find that balance you were talking of. Yeah. Now, what's interesting here is that the very way of thinking that Newton gave us tends to be black and white, good or bad. And it's a symptom of the fact that we're immersed in that kind of thinking. And it's deep in us, all of us, me included, both of you as well, just by virtue of living in this part of the world at this point in time, that we tend to think automatically without reflection that you either need planning or you need control. Planning and control, or you need freedom and creativity, which is the cycle you were describing, Lewis, that you kind of gone from one extreme perhaps to the other. The sweet spot is to have enough of each and to think carefully about the character or kind of constraint or structure you have. There's nothing wrong with the structure per se. If you look at nature, it's highly structured, highly ordered, highly patterned. but it's not a hierarchical control based
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's structured in many different ways, and I think that anybody who says is called, and in it he talks about the difference between convergent and divergent problems. So convergent problems being those problems where there is a right answer, you never quite get to it because everything's a bit imperfect. It's the reason why all cars look increasingly the same, because there is an ideal design for a modern motor car. It's also a sign that we're getting to the end of the life of that particular form, I think. But anyway, that's another conversation. And then divergent problems, where the system never settles. It moves backwards and forwards. It oscillates between, let's say, in fact, funny enough, education is the example he gives. And he says, on the one hand, education needs to be ordered and structured, and on the other hand, it needs to be free and creative. But what he doesn't say is you need to find the magic midpoint. What he says is you need to be able to sensitively move backwards and forwards, taking into account the context, which in your case would be the children that you have at the time, the weather, what's going on in the rest of the world around you, in order to sense which way to move and to develop that capacity to keep tracking and moving. Now, the coda is, he says that all interesting and important human problems are divergent. And without getting into too much detail, it feels to me like we've spent 300 or 400 years treating every problem as if it was convergent. And we're now trying to kind of get ourselves beyond that and get off that drug.
Yeah.
Yes, it's interesting you were just talking there about power and control and hierarchy, and when you were describing the kind of containers or the experiences that you design for people, I was going to ask you whether you thought, obviously you're trying to encourage connection, you're trying to encourage freedom and space to be creative and perhaps solve problems together. Do you think a key to your work is about sort of challenging that kind of normal perception of there's somebody in control of the situation and somebody's in charge, and we listen to them and we follow the instructions, and actually to try and flatten the hierarchy? Do you feel that that is part of your work, and do you think that's a new way of moving forward, or do you still feel like actually in order for these sessions of connection and communication to happen, somebody is going to be the person with the power?
Great question, one. Although it's kind of about 6 questions.
Sorry. Yeah.
So taking one at a time, power doesn't go away. Power is always there. You can't not have power between people. So one of the mistakes is to think, oh, we don't want politics and power. Where people gather, there are politics, and power is wielded somehow or other. So any group or organization of people trying to do something together has to work with power, and they can do that consciously or unconsciously. The traditional way we've thought about that is institutionalizing it and making it a top-down hierarchy and giving power to a small number of people who are normally of the same kind. But power doesn't go away. So you always have to deal with that. There is always power. But the thing is, what the power does and what you do with it and who has it can change and move and flow. And so the containers I try and design have a kind of different attitude to power and the responsibility that goes along with it. So, for example, in the things which I run and organize, I have had to accept that I have power. It's not a position I naturally aspire to or particularly want. But as you rightly said, you need somebody to say, it starts at 7. That's an exercise in power, And by the way, not all cultures have that. Sometimes people might say it starts at sundown, which is a looser definition. Sometimes whatever it is, might start when everybody's there, and who everybody is might be something that's in the warp and weft of that particular culture. So it doesn't have to be that way. But in our culture, that at least is a sort of prosaic but important example of what you can devote energy to controlling that is fruitful and productive. So that's the way I think of my work, is to control those things which need to be controlled. There needs to be food, there needs to be shelter, there needs to be some sense of a plan. But that plan can be much different from what we normally think. So at the end of June, we'll be doing what's called Yellow 3D, which is our in-person unconference thing. And we do have a plan for that. It starts on a Wednesday afternoon, it ends on a Sunday lunchtime. And the plan is in the morning, there'll be breakfast. Around the middle of the day, there'll be lunch. And then in the evening, there'll be something else to eat. That's the plan. And what's interesting about that, that doesn't mean that's all we do. It's not like then sort of sit back and hope. What there is some careful thought about who's coming, some careful thought about what resources and materials, some very, very carefully crafted invitations, because you have to send them information anyway before they come. So in those invitations, you might be cueing or suggesting, come with a question or come with an issue, don't come with your party piece, whatever it is. So there's a lot of work to be doing, tending, clearing, and holding the space that isn't about trying to determine what people do or tell them what to do. And then there's another bit once you get going, which is paying close attention to what happens, which will always be what you don't expect. And of course, what's happening is not just the events, but it's the emotional flows, paying attention to who's upset, who's quiet, who's loud, who's drifting off, who's, not paying attention, whatever. And asking yourself how that might be used fruitfully.
Hey, outdoor leaders, are you familiar with that feeling of spending the whole day holding other people's needs, trying to keep spirits up by cooking treats over the fire, only to get home and be faced with yet more mental load and cooking chores? We get it, it's exhausting. But what if we told you there's a game changer that could make your evenings a whole lot easier? Enter HelloFresh, the household name in meal kit delivery. You've probably heard of them, but have you given them a try? If not, now's the perfect time to experience the convenience and deliciousness that they bring to the table. And guess what? As a thank you for supporting our show, HelloFresh is offering our listeners an incredible deal. Just follow the link in our podcast show notes to enjoy a fantastic 60% off your first box, plus 25% off for the next 2 months, along with some free gifts. Imagine coming home to a box full of fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and easy-to-follow recipes, ready to help you whip up tasty meals without the stress. It's like having a personal sous chef right in your kitchen. So why not give yourself a break and let HelloFresh do the heavy listening? Click on that link in the show notes and treat yourself to some well-deserved relaxation. Thank you again to HelloFresh for supporting outdoor leaders like us.
This is so interesting because
so
that is
good.
so. I feel like you have described a good forest school session again, and it's very interesting to me, that role of and people do debate it in forest schools, whether it's are you a forest school leader, are you a facilitator, are you what do we call ourselves? Because leader feels wrong for the kind of the structure, the ethos of it. But there's something about that a lot of people, when they're new to forest school, I was having a conversation with someone the other day about, especially if you're from a more traditional teaching background, and then you move to this model of education, you start asking, what am I actually doing? Like, am I proving my worth? Am I giving enough? Because the control is a lot more relaxed, and that the description you just gave of you are tending and clearing and holding the space. You're not just holding the space, you're doing all that groundwork beforehand and the maintenance on the space, whatever, and the space being both physical and metaphorical. And then noticing, you describe, of like, it's blooming hard work, so a lot of us might be really self-critical and go, God, what did I actually do that session? God, I don't think I taught them enough about the natural world, or I don't think I really showed them they could use that technique next time they're like doing that thing that they were doing. I could have shown them that knot or whatever. And actually, you're being so attuned to, as you say, people's emotions and what they're saying, and oh my goodness.
I mean, it's a different kind of work. So it's not nothing. So it's a different kind of work. I think there's a word missing in the English language. It's interesting. I just read a fabulous novel. I finished it this morning, called The Dictionary of Lost Words, which is beautiful and sad and tragic. But there's always going to be missing or lost words. And one of the words I think is missing or lost, perhaps, is a word that sits somewhere between effort and attention. So in that work you're describing, when there's something that the person leading, and I'll come back to leading in a minute, because I think it's as good a word as any, but we'll come back to that. The person leading, there's something that they're doing that is a little bit more than simply paying attention, or at least, I mean, that's the word I tend to end up using because it's the only one I've got, but it's a sort of very active, careful kind of attention on many levels of being. So kind of, I don't know much about a kind of mystic or psychoanalytic world, but it feels to me like you're doing more than just looking and hearing. You're paying attention in a deeper level, which is partly why it's very tiring. You're giving of yourself. So so there's attention over there, and then there's effort over here, but I don't like effort, not even the kind of expression that people have taken up using, which is of efforting, which just feels slightly clumsy to me. But I know why they're sort of doing that, because there is something beyond just the paying attention. And that's where I feel there's this gap, which really is work in a good sense. That is good work, you know.
Mm.
But somehow it isn't effort, and it isn't just kind of passive. And so I think that's what the leader is doing. And the reason I think leader is a good word for it is because there's no perfect word, and you can get into such silly debates about, and who knows what any word means to each of us anyway. But I mean, bear in mind, I'm biased because I work in leadership studies. But the thing is, leadership is a broad church already. There are many different kinds of leadership. When people have that reaction about, oh, it doesn't feel right, it feels authoritative, that's just because they're drawing on, or actually subject to, what we would call the heroic leader myth, which is one of the most resistant and unhelpful myths of leadership in our kind of modern world. It really does refuse to lay down and die. But the heroic myth sort of says that the leader is the person, it all comes to them. And that doesn't just present a sort of military leadership in that sense. The heroism can be that excessive responsibility that a leader or teacher, or whatever word you want, feels for the learning of the people they're with. Because there's a sense, this is particularly true for me working with adults, but even working with children, there is part that is theirs to do. You can't do it all for them. In fact, if you look at the modern education system, in a way, where it's gone wrong is it's tried to do as much as possible, and it ends up as a tick box ticking exercise. So I think that for me, I think because leader does solve the other problem for people coming to it who feel it might be all a bit wishy-washy and vague. You go, no, the leaders, they do this. And then what you do is qualify the kind of leadership you're talking about. And there's servant leadership. There's all kinds of different kind of ways of thinking about leadership, distributed leadership. The one I most like is the idea of leaders as gardeners. The gardeners and gardening leadership, if you want to call it that, they seed, they feed, and they weed. And of course, that just is lovely and memorable. And it's something we talk about at the business school here in Oxford. But that I think captures really well that idea of, yes, you're doing something, but also captures another thing, which is that the seed isn't something the leader creates in this gardening metaphor. The seed itself is growing itself, but it needs water and nutrients and light. And if it's overwhelmed by invading species and weeds and bugs, then it'll struggle. So the job to cultivate, and actually notice where that verb comes from culture, which originally, in the organic world. So you're cultivating a garden in forest, working within a natural environment where those jobs of seeding, weeding, and feeding. So a leader in a forest school might seed ideas or thoughts or exercises, might kind of feed them by offering suggestions, encouragement, support, and then weed them by kind of by just keeping a hand on the tiller and kind of go, no, we're not going to all go off and jump in the river right now. Or we might do that later, whatever it is. And so that there's a kind of, I don't know, winnowing is another lovely verb. I actually saw somebody winnowing once, which I found extraordinary.
What is winnowing? I've never heard this word.
It's a beautiful ancient verb, which means to sort the wheat from the chaff. So you have a pile of grain that has been threshed, and with a pitchfork, you toss it in the air. The wind blows the chaff away and the grain falls. So it's a slow, laborious, careful way of sorting and improving the quality, actually, of the crop. And so that way of sorting, of selecting, is a nice image as well, because it's the wind that blows away what you don't want. It's very different from a machine that does it, or from trying to pick out each grain, which would be horribly laborious. And you can't really do it fast, I mean, this is all, nobody does it anymore. This was decades ago I saw it, and even then it was centuries out of date. But anyway.
That is, that's such a nice metaphor, and it's kind of touched on. Oh, you've touched on so many of the points I was gonna talk about, like how I really love in the books that all these words that are like active ownership words that give people a sense of. There's something, I think, initially when I came across the Do Pause books, I thought it was going to be about stopping, about doing nothing, about doing, but actually like when we're saying about, forest school leaders feeling like, well, what even am I doing in this moment? Your books are both full of so many empowering verbs that people can own in sense of going, I'm doing this and I'm doing this and I'm reflecting and I'm doing this and these are the reasons I'm doing that stuff. And that's like, that's so important, I think, not just for us in roles, because that was the other thing I was going to say was like, we were talking about the different, why don't we, or do we like the word leaders? And as you were describing all those different things, I was like, well, that's for me why I have problems trying to pin the word down, because it changes from moment to moment, whether I am leading the group circle because that's part of the routine, but then if you come back and look at what I'm doing 5 minutes later, I am subservient in a play cycle with someone because they need to act out that I'm a dragon and they're killing me. And then you come back 5 minutes later and I'm, now I'm telling someone about the particular trees and I'm a party. My role is moving so much that it doesn't have a single verb that I am doing all the time. It changes. If I can follow on from this metaphor we've got about gardening, one of the notes that I made, because I really loved the Pause book. I read Pause before I read Improvise, and I loved the practices in it, and especially there's a bit where you're talking about I think it's the Tibetan temples where they have a log across the door at about 1 foot high, and the idea there is it's like an intentional. You have to stop and pick your feet up and think, I am now going into this space, and it's like a built-in pause. And then as I was reading all these things, I was like, oh, these are amazing exercises. And for me, I got caught up in this idea of, like, as often happens with groups that I'm working with, like, oh, this would be so great if I think the group will get so much out of this. But they won't go for it. There's, like you were saying about you seed, and then it's not our job to do everything. There's that thing of like, what we can do is set up invitations for pause or offerings for pause, particularly with younger children. I think the note I wrote down was, can you make someone pause, or do you just make them wait? It's pausing something people have to go, I am pausing,
Yes, in general. I think because otherwise, I mean, I'm sure there can be circumstances where somebody could productively impose a pause. Like in the middle of a family argument, like, hang on a minute, should we just take a moment? So that would not be voluntarily coming from everyone in the group, but it would need to rise in somebody. I think if you schedule a break, in one sense, it is a pause. Yeah, actually, I'm discovering what I think about this as I'm talking, and so I think that the richest, deepest ones are those the more conscious your level of pausing, the more that you're initiating it, choosing to, remembering to, the more value it's going to have for you, and the more worth and the more learning opportunity. But a pause imposed by someone else, or even a pause imposed by a schedule, can still be kind of very productive. A break in a long business meeting where people get to go outside and say what they really feel, or just shoot the breeze or whatever. So I think you can engineer, and I use that verb deliberately, a pause, but I think it has less potential, I think, than learning to sense and feel when a pause is required. So the way I came to think of pauses was as a way that we shift our relationship with time, a way that we modulate. And much like you, Lewis, at the beginning, the reason I got interested in the first place was because it seemed that pausing is not necessarily slow. It sort of sits anywhere on the fast to slow spectrum, and that felt right. I mean, personally, I think we do need to slow down, but pausing is a way to ask yourself, is now the moment when I need to slow down? And it may be that much of the time one does, but it may be that sometimes actually the opposite is true. You need to keep going and go with the energy. So I think there was an interesting thing you said there I wanted to pick up, which was, I think we live in language, and the language that we speak, or languages that we speak in the West anyway, are heavy on nouns. We pay more attention, give more importance to nouns. So we ask sort of, what is the name or title that we are giving to this person who is leading, teaching, facilitating the thing. Whereas what you are calling attention to is that you are doing very many things, that you are involved in continuous activity which ebbs and flows and shifts between a position of authority when you're leading the story circle to a position of complete submission when you're being killed by the dragon. And so part of our struggle here is because we are kind of educated, and I mean that rather than schooled. I mean education in the broader sense. Our society lays great store by the names and labels that we put on things, which are always nouns. They are things. There's a wonderful and huge book by Ian McGilchrist called The Matter with Things, and it's a very apposite title. And he would argue that actually, there is part of us, quite literally part of us, one hemisphere of our brain that is thing-based, and the other hemisphere of our brain, which is sort of flow-based, you might argue, and that the two have got out of kilter, and that the one of them we've given too much importance to. So I just think that the more that we can think of, even if you take something as simple as my name, so I am Rob names me as an object, and people will ask me, do you like to be Rob or Robert? And that immediately gives the lie to the fact that I'm one thing, because in some contexts I'll be Rob and in other I'll be Robert. But I would go further, and there's a lovely South Park animation style version of an Alan Watts talk from way back when, where he talks about, you'll find it online if you look for it, where he talks about actually I am Robin is what I'm actually doing. I am in a continuous process of being me. I am a flow, both literally a flow of organic matter and material, a flow of ideas, in this case, a flow of conversation. I'm never fixed, static, not until I'm dead anyway. And so we're all kind of verbs. And so any kind of, one of the other things I think I try and do in my work is nudge back in the direction of verbs. So when you say, what if somebody doesn't want to do this exercise? What if somebody resists? That gives importance to this exercise. Mm-hmm. Whereas a very wise friend of mine said to me many years ago when I was first starting out on this path, when I said, what do I do if something doesn't work? And he said, can it not work? And I was still in my head, I was running away, and I was kind of going, well, of course it can. It could be a disaster. They could refuse to play. And then he says, would that be it not working, or would that just be it working in a way you hadn't anticipated? Yeah. And so if you can shift from the it working, that's a noun, to what's going on, present continuous, right here, right now, and what is happening is somebody's resisting. Oh, there is resisting, which is different from there's resistance. Because there's resistance means I'm going to overcome that resistance because I want to impose my plan, because I've thought about it and I really care and I really love these children and I want it to be good. So lots of good motives, right? But if you notice, there is resisting, then the improv practice would go, great. What can we do with resisting? WhatsApp audio. Oh, sorry, it's somebody calling me. I'll turn off my phone. Yeah, so there, if you ask yourself, well, if you notice what's going on, you can go, well, how can we use that? So you can go into inquiry, you can try and understand. It may be that there's a really good reason that somebody is resisting that exercise, and it may be that they've got a better exercise, or that what the group really needs to do is something else. And your ideas may have been lovely and well-intentioned and beautiful, but if so, they'll have another day, and that, of course, reduces the tension and anxiety and stress that you feel, because then you're not wrong. It's not that you haven't prepared properly. It's not that you're not doing your job or not doing anything. Quite the opposite. You're paying attention enough to notice that somebody doesn't want to do what I thought we might do at this point. So maybe you could get them to help you. Say, well, what would you like to do instead? Or is there a way we could make this interesting to you? And then you're back in flow again, and all you've had to do is give up a little bit of ego.
Hey, outdoor leaders, are you familiar with that feeling of spending the whole day holding other people's needs, trying to keep spirits up by cooking treats over the fire, only to get home and be faced with yet more mental load and cooking chores? We get it, it's exhausting. But what if we told you there's a game changer that could make your evenings a whole lot easier? enter HelloFresh, the household name in meal kit delivery. You've probably heard of them, but have you given them a try? If not, now's the perfect time to experience the convenience and deliciousness that they bring to the table. And guess what? As a thank you for supporting our show, HelloFresh is offering our listeners an incredible deal. Just follow the link in our podcast show notes to enjoy a fantastic 60% off your first box, plus 25% off for the next 2 months, along with some free gifts. Imagine coming home to a box full of fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and easy-to-follow recipes, ready to help you whip up tasty meals without the stress. It's like having a personal sous chef right in your kitchen. So why not give yourself a break and let HelloFresh do the heavy listening? Click on that link in the show notes and treat yourself to some well-deserved relaxation. Thank you again to HelloFresh for supporting outdoor leaders like us. That's the word, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just you're
Whoa.
so it's the ego and the the culture of we do this and then we do this and then we do this and there is a schedule, as you're describing. We are so attached to that because most of us do work in environments where there is quite a big element of that. You know, someone has either told us that
Absolutely.
we're going to do this, then this, then this, or that's the only way the thing is going to happen, is if it happens in these things. But when you are working with people in these kind of environments, be it education or designing stuff or any kind of project based sort of communication situation, then there doesn't have to be that. And I just wish that I really want like
No.
every person who's beginning on their forest school journey, like whether they're in training or they're just thinking about it, to listen to this episode of the podcast, because I think it's so helpful. And it's that process of stepping away from that, like there is a plan and I have failed if my plan doesn't go to plan. And even I've met somebody who said they went on a forest school training course and they said that their trainer told them, they questioned it and said, what if the kids don't go for the ideas and the activities that I've planned? Like, what do I do? And the forest school trainer said to them, well, that'll be your problem. You haven't sold the activities well enough. And I was just like, oh God,
It was
it was
it
so
was
Ouch.
bad.
believe
I sort of
wince.
thought,
That's
this is
that.
not good.
But let's be compassionate here. So why would somebody say that who's in the forest school movement? You know, because as you rightly said, Gwen, that's the way that's what we've been subject to. And this, I think, is a great gift that those of you working with this kind of education are giving to the children, because that was an adult, presumably, somebody who's been through probably quite a conventional set of schooling. And let's assume for the moment that they had kind and gentle and even inspirational teachers.
Absolutely.
It still would have been in a system, as you described, one where there's a schedule and there's a kind of a way of thinking that infects everything, that you do this, then that, and you have to, there'll be things people don't want to do, but they're good for them, and so on and so forth. And so that adult, even though they're in the forest school system, has themselves been subject to all of that. They can't see how deeply it's got into them. Whereas what you're doing is you're offering, through the experience, you and others doing work like this, to younger people, you're offering them a different way of being. They will not have that same automatic assumption about we have to do this, then this, then this. So, we can be compassionate to the adult who said that, and at the same time be kind of really kind of warm-hearted about the ambition here is to not subject people to that sort of death by a thousand cuts, that insistent and persistent idea that gets so deep into you can't even see it. You're giving
sometimes
people
we've internalized, haven't we? We've internalized that thing of like, it's my turn now. I know so many people that I think genuinely, I think you could boil a lot of their views down to, well, this was done to me, or I had to go through this, and now I'm in the authority position, and so I get to do it down. That's the way of the world, is when it's, and going, well, when you're a grown up, you can do this. Well, when you're, when it's your turn, and like, it's just like, I didn't get to do this. It does remind me that of I had there's the other extreme of this, which is my son, who so he never went to a preschool or a nursery, never went to child, but he was with us, and so he was exposed to my wonky views on the world from day dot. And he had a football club that he used to go to, and the last few sessions that he went to, he ended up not going, and I noticed each time he would go and talk to the person leading. This was when he was maybe 4, and he would go and talk to the person, and then he would walk away, and then he'd come over to me and go, "I think I'm ready to go home now." I'll go, "Okay," and then I sort of, because I was trying to give him a bit of space, a bit of like, "Okay, this is your space. Not everything has to be with me." And then he said, "I don't want to go this week." I said, "Okay, well, what's up?" He said, "Well, every time I tell the coach my ideas for games we could do with the ball, he doesn't want to listen, and he says we're just doing his games." And because he had come from this, he'd only ever been to us in the woods, and so he'd come from this extreme space of like, there is no hierarchy here. We just pull in whatever games come. And so for him, it was really shocking the other way to go. Lots of children come to us and are surprised by how much we get them to bring or involve them in the planning, because they're so used to, if you wanted to be divisive, you could call it spoon feeding. If they're used to waiting to be told what the activities are, and so we have to sort of gently bring people out of that space of like you were saying about what do you bring, going, come with some games. People that have been with us for years arrive going, right, here's what we're doing today, Lewis and Wem, this is what I've come up, we're all for it. But my son had the opposite experience, where he was so used to sharing ideas and having them validated.
And I think that's something which I'm sure you talk about a lot. I mean, as a parent and with children of other friends and other friends of mine, when you choose an education experience for children that is different from the norm, the kind of the re-entry, the reconnection, or the when you rub up against the kind of more regular world, that can be a very sensitive kind of thing, because you've learned a set of norms. So it doesn't come without its own difficulty, but that's no reason to shy away from it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It was making me think, I wondered if you had so you talked about the Project Yellow, and mentioned that you've been doing this for some years now. I wondered if you had seen, as we see in our sessions, this like long-term progression of like people repeatedly being exposed to opportunities to pause and opportunities to improvise, and we see massive progression in people in their like self-esteem and confidence, not through anything that we're necessarily like giving them. Do you know what I mean? It's just through exposure to these experiences. Do you have people repeatedly come to your experiences?
Yeah. I mean, Yellow's kind of just the most recent in a long line of things I've been doing for the last 25 or 30 years, and some people have kind of been involved all that time, in different ways at different times. So yeah, I think when people start to see that there's a different way of being, really, it's not that the way that we have currently is necessarily wrong or without value. And by the way we currently have, I mean the kind of conventional system of kind of control. It's easy to sort of damn it, but it grew up for a reason and it served us in a certain way. The real problem with it is that we don't realize it's a way of thinking or a way of being. We think it's how things are. And as soon as you get into that space, when you're blind to the fact that there are other options, then even unconsciously it can become almost ideological. Because much of my work, I think, is very threatening for many people, and that's kind of why they will either kind of challenge or push back or question, is because they feel that what they're doing is interpreting that I'm saying you shouldn't be like that, you should be like this. And what I'm trying to encourage them to think about is, how do I want to be? But in order to do that, you have to say to somebody, you see how you are? You see that you could be otherwise?
Yeah.
All those things that you think are givens, you could question them, you could challenge them. I don't use it at the moment, but for a while I used a version of my CV which began, for Rob, career is more of a verb than a noun. So it's verbs and nouns again. I stopped using it because nobody got it. Because what I meant was,
I got it. I like it.
Yeah. So as a verb, to career is what you do in a soapbox cart going down a hill, going, whoa, bit out of control. Whereas career as a noun is a sort of serious, grown-up planned kind of a thing. And so, yeah, I think people. What I really love about that kind of lasting nature of the work is often in a short session, people might take something from it that lasts them for years. I mean, literally, there are many, many people who will contact me or phone me up and say, "Oh, I was in a 2-hour session with you 6.5 years ago," and so it. And what's interesting is that's not something that I necessarily set as a goal. It's not like that's the measure of impact I'm seeking. It's just that when you connect with people in a certain way, things can enter very quickly. And it'll be when those individuals who say that, it's because they've opened up and they've connected it with something that's important and meaningful to them. It's not because I've kind of seen that coming and known what to say. But again, you're back to cultivating the conditions, and it won't happen for everybody, of course. Um, so yeah, I think the bigger arc as well is I've been doing work with improvisation for 25 years or more, and it's gone from being seen as a sort of lunatic fringe activity to not quite being normal, but very accepted, very understood. At least in the world of further and tertiary education, people kind of get it quite easily.
Do you think it's being valued differently as a skill? You were talking about CVs. Do you think it would land differently if you put it on a CV now as if you did 10, 15 years ago?
I do. I think, in fact, there's a before and after here with the pandemic. So I rewrote the book on improvisation after the pandemic because when I looked at the book, which was originally published in 2013, it felt to me that I was kind of methinks the lady doth protest too much. I was arguing a bit too hard for why improvisation would be useful and necessary. It felt out of kilter with the times because after you've lived through a global pandemic, I think it's pretty self-evident that there's plenty you can't control and that could have a huge impact. So yeah, I think still many people are wary of it. It depends on the personality, what their walk of life is, but definitely I think there's a change, and I think that behoves those of us trying to work with change. I'm not got to a point where I'm not really sure what that means anymore, but this idea that things could be otherwise, that we don't have to submit to a kind of a continuation of business as usual. Let's call it that. So I think if you're working in that, it's good to notice those long arcs because the work can be very dispiriting. There's plenty of barriers and obstacles you come up against. There's progress never feels fast enough. I'm not sure that actually any of us, even while you're involved in it, have a good notion even of what progress would look like or quite what that means. And so to be able to occasionally take a step back and look over the long view and kind of go, well, yeah, the things I'm involved with now seem of more interest to more people than they were before, because the world, on the one hand, it moves very fast, but in other ways, it moves from our perspectives, from the perspective of our hopes and desires, it moves very slowly. And again, really, probably the way it progresses is through educating children differently. It probably moves in a generational cycle. So again, the work of forest schools and the children in the forest, your own particular work, is arguably the most important work that could be being done. And you're not going to ever get to kind of go, we've done it. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
No, well, unless you have that emotional response, which I'm sure you have every single day when some little episode, something happens with a child or with a group of children, and you kind of go, there it is. But you're never going to get the certificate.
That's really interesting because that leads into a thing I was just thinking, because I mean, we've brought it up a few times now, these nouns and verbs things, and saying you're never gonna get it. And I was thinking, like, okay, so already we're in this world of like, what's the it? And actually, when you were talking about, so I think there's a parallel here between your work with leadership, people involved in leadership, and our work, and people who are in our position are in work where they are, say, externally hired to come and deliver in a school. So they're not a teacher who's full-time in the school. They go to school A on Monday and school B on Tuesday and school C. And I was thinking there's a similarity there between that and people who are not quite at the top of a leadership hierarchy, in that how do we marry belief in improvisation with possibly less autonomy than we would like to have? So I'm imagining for people in our situation who might be going into schools, they might be fully believing there's this benefit of improvisation, and in the long run, and they want to do this holistic thing, and the barrier that lots of people come up against is, okay, but the school want to see progress in X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, the thing, and I'm wondering if there's a parallel there between people who are in sort of middle management, who might go, I'd love to improvise around this, I'd love to improvise here, but I've got to deliver on ABC.
Yeah.
How do we marry that if you don't have the agency and autonomy that sometimes people feel you need to have to improvise?
Everybody's got a they. Everybody has a they. They won't let me. They aren't giving me what I need. It doesn't matter how much obvious power you would seem to have. There's always a they. So even if you're in a visible position that would seem to be able to wield a huge amount of power, I often think people in visible positions of leadership actually the least powerful. So I think there's a myth around that. So that's not to say that people who are coming in and coming out school A, school B each day aren't operating under significant constraint, but it is simply to point out that there is always significant constraint. So it's the pot at the end of the rainbow to think, well, one day I'll have it, and once I get there, I'll do it. So then the question is to take some advice from Theodore Roosevelt, who, American president at the beginning of the 20th century. He said, do what you can, where you are, with what you've got. So you think creatively about how what might you do that is faithful to the kind of work you're interested in, that might nudge the scores that you need to deliver in the direction that they need to go. And even if it's just a tiny detail, even if you have to work with crumbs and morsels, big movements and big changes have a habit of starting in small and invisible places. So don't be discouraged or dispirited by that. The other thing is, don't assume that the constraint is as real as you think it is. Most times, there's many, many stories throughout history from all walks of life where people push back against what they believe to be the constraint or the limitation, and it turns out it isn't really there. That often we're imagining or projecting that something is being enforced when the enforcers are too busy enforcing something else that matters to them to really enforce it. So I think there are almost always more opportunities than one realizes. And if nothing else, to start by accepting defeat seems a little bit negative. I think that you can accurately perceive the constraints and go, well, first of all, you can say, what are the real constraints? Let me really think about those. I'll give you an example from a former life of mine. So I used to work in advertising, and there was a copywriter at an agency I worked at who was what I would call an old school copywriter, because he was one who had a kind of novel in his bottom drawer. And at the agency at the time, they had different kinds of clients. They had the small budget ones that afforded them a lot of creative freedom, where they would win awards, enhance their reputation. And they had the big blue chip companies where they would earn their money. And of course, all the creative people, all the other copywriters wanted to work on the things with the freedom to win awards with these little clients that were going to be happy with anything. And nobody wanted to work on the big things that made the money. But of course, the agency cared about the big things that made the money. So this copywriter volunteered to work on the big things that made the money, to the dismay of the rest of the creative department. And then he went, okay, first let me learn the rules. Right, we're writing radio advertising, and there are all these rules. And there were tons of rules about when you have to show the product, how many mentions of this, who can be in it, who can't be in it, all sorts of things. And he learned them really, really well. And then the end of the story is they end up at a conference presenting to the client globally with all the other agencies, all the other countries there. And he reads out his radio script. And everybody in the room is going, you can't say it, because, oh, no, but you, oh. And what they were doing, he'd understood the roles so well and come out the other side and found a creative way to work with them, not to try and break them. And everybody had not taken the effort to do that. So the first thing to do is understand the real constraints such as they are, and then ask yourself, how can I use them? This is the improv practice. How can I work with them? And to not set yourself unrealistic goals, and to be compassionate with yourself about moving in the right direction and doing a bit more, than other people would, or that you could before. And you'll be surprised by how quickly things can open up or change or shift.
We used to sometimes refer to things as, we just need to get the foot in the door there. We need to go and do this much within what they're asking for, because once we're in there, then we can start to push it very slightly and go, well, wouldn't it be great? Let me show you this thing. Let me show you that thing.
Well, and another thing is an honest appraisal. If you're really honest appraisal of the opportunity you have, and there is none, then you have to ask yourself, why am I choosing to be here?
Yeah.
That's a big reflection, isn't it, to take on board. Robert, I'm very conscious of time. Is there anything that, so far, before we wrap things up, is there anything you're like, oh God, I wish you'd asked me about this? Is there anything we've stuffed up on, or notes? So I've got Post-its all over my desk. Is there anything that we've missed that you're going, oh, don't go without talking to me about this?
Well, I'd like to mention the new book, which is about conversation,
Yes,
which really
yes.
flows in and out of the books about pause and improvisation. And really, I suppose, just to say, so if I look at this body of work, that's now been 12 years altogether. And it would be easy to describe what I've done as if I had planned and organized it. The set of relationships between these three books is really neat. It's really tightly overlapped, but each one adds something new. And actually, that all came out. This is the way, for me, the world works, is that beautiful, elegant pattern, which I'm still working on, because I think some point I'll have a realization about what underlies all three of them. But just to say that things which emerge in a very kind of pleasing and ordered way don't feel like that when you're fumbling forward. I was just doing one thing after another, responding to what was coming at me, picking up opportunities that seemed interesting. And lo and behold, looking back, it now kind of makes a really interesting kind of sense. So I just offer that thought to anybody who's kind of fumbling their way forward and not quite sure what they're doing. You kind of go, well, don't worry, it's not that there's any guarantee of how it will work out, or that it will work out at all, but that we make sense of things after they've happened, when we're in the thick of them. And I think that's a contrast I love, is the idea of being in the thick of things rather than trying to be on top of them. I think to be in the thick of things is probably to be where you need to be. And if it doesn't seem to make sense yet, wait a while.
Pause.
Pause. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for chatting with us today, Robert. It's been really a refreshing conversation, and we've got lots out of it.
Well, thank you. And the work you're doing is amazing. And please, let's stay in touch. And I'd love to come down and see you guys in the forest with the children.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Fantastic.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Bye. And now is the time when we thank the fantastic people that are supporting us on Patreon, on patreon.com/The Forest School Podcast. So thank you to Karen and Matthew, Catherine, Gareth, Rebecca, Rosie, Julie, Rachel, Candice, Claire, Heidi, Louise, Michael, and Anna. Thank you all so much for your support. It really does help support the work that we are doing. And don't forget, if you want to get ad-free episodes and our bonus episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/The Forest School Podcast.